In 2006, a conservator picked up the brooch that Turkey had spent $30 million and 6 years of diplomatic pressure to bring home. Something felt wrong, not visually, not chemically, just the weight. The real brooch weighed 14.3 grams. The one in the display case weighed 23.5. The sound of a lie does not always make noise. Sometimes it is simply 9 grams too heavy. Consider what that means. A man had spent the better part of his career fighting to bring this object home from New York. He had given interviews, written letters, stood in American courtrooms, and argued that this brooch belonged to the soil and the people that had produced it. When it finally came back, there were ceremonies. Officials shook hands in front of cameras. He was described, in the Turkish press, in terms that amounted to a kind of quiet heroism. And then every evening, when the museum closed and the last visitor left, he would walk past the display case and see the thing under the lights, the gleam of it, the warmth that gold holds when a lamp is trained on it. He was the only person in the world who knew that what was gleaming in that case was scrap. 9 grams. That is the distance between a 2,500-year-old object of incalculable value and a cheap fabrication assembled in a workshop sometime in 2005. 9 grams is also the precise weight of a man's reputation, a museum's credibility, and an entire argument about international justice. The brooch of Croesus was not stolen only once, it was stolen twice. The first time, by men with shovels who did not know what they were standing on. The second time, by the man who had sworn to protect it. Sardis, Kingdom of Lydia. Circa 560 BCE. It began as Heat. A craftsman, whose name was never recorded, took a piece of gold alloyed to 22 carats and worked it into the shape of a hippocamp, the winged seahorse that appeared on Lydian coins, on temple friezes, at the prows of ceremonial ships. The creature occupied a specific place in the cosmology of the ancient world. It was a creature of thresholds, of the boundary between the known sea and whatever existed beyond it. Not quite of one world, not quite of the other. The brooch measured 3.4 centimeters in height and 2 centimeters across. It weighed, when finished, 14.3 grams, light enough to pin to linen without pulling the weave. The craftsman achieved this not by using less gold, but by understanding what gold could do when worked with genuine knowledge of its properties. Stretched, shaped into hollow forms that held their structure without requiring mass to do so. Along the surface of the hippocamp's body, he applied granulation. Individual beads of gold, each no larger than the tip of a pin, were fused to the surface using a technique that modern metallurgists would spend nearly 2,000 years attempting to reverse engineer. The process, known as colloidal soldering, involved no conventional solder. A copper salt solution was applied to each bead and the gold beneath it, and when heated, the copper reduced and fused the two surfaces at the atomic level. The join was invisible. Under a magnifying glass, the beads appeared to grow from the surface, as if they had always been there, as if the gold itself had chosen that particular arrangement. This is what made the object irreplaceable, not its age, not its material value. The granulation on the surface of the Lydian brooch was evidence of a specific kind of knowledge that had existed in one civilization, been lost, and never been fully recovered. Every bead was a data point from a tradition that no longer had living practitioners. Croesus, king of Lydia, was the wealthiest man in the known world. This was not a reputation he left to others to maintain. He funded the construction of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. He sent gold ingots to the oracle at Delphi as gifts so extravagant that they were still on display centuries after his death. When Herodotus wanted to describe the upper limit of human wealth, he did not reach for an abstraction. He used a name, wealthy, as Croesus. The phrase passed through Greek, through Latin, through every major European language, and it is still used today by people who have no idea. It refers to a specific man, Dine, who ruled a specific kingdom on the western coast of what is now Turkey in the 6th century before the Common Era. The brooch was not the most valuable object in his treasury. It was, however, among the most carefully made. In the burial mound outside the village of Gure, a Lydian princess was interred with objects chosen to accompany her. The brooch was placed on her chest, near her shoulder, pinning the burial cloth closed. In the sealed darkness of the chamber, surrounded by silver vessels and gold pieces that no living eye would see again for 25 centuries, it settled into the earth and waited. The weight of that waiting is not a metaphor. Soil presses. Moisture shifts. Over 2,500 years, objects change, corrode, collapse under the slow accumulation of geological time. The fact that the brooch survived intact, the granulation unbroken, the hippocamp still mid-leap above the surface of the gold, is itself a statement about the quality of the work that had produced it. The craftsman who made it had built something stronger than he could possibly have intended. Gure, Turkey, 1965. The men who found it were farmers. The mound had been on the edge of the land for as long as anyone in the village could remember. What they were looking for was not history. That is not a judgment. It is simply an accurate account of the circumstances. These were men of modest means in a small village in western Turkey. And when the ground gives up gold, the first thought is not scholarship. When the first torch beam entered the burial chamber and fell across the objects on the floor, the brooch caught the light in the way that 22-carat gold catches light. Not with a flash, not with the cold brightness of lower alloys, but with a depth and warmth that is specific to gold, worked at that purity. It had been underground for 25 centuries, and it looked, to the men standing in that tunnel, as though it had been placed there the previous week. The granulation was intact, every bead in place. They picked it up, New York, 1968 to 1993. The brooch moved quickly after that, from the men who found it to a smuggler in Izmir, from Izmir to a network of dealers who understood that Lydian gold from a royal tomb, while not something that could be sold openly, could be sold to institutions that had learned, over decades, to manage their own curiosity about provenance. In 1968, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York acquired more than 200 objects that had come from the burial mound outside Gure. The collection was referred to internally as the Lydian Hoard. The brooch was among them. The Metropolitan Museum was, and remains, one of the most respected cultural institutions in the world. It was not a naive buyer. The provenance documentation for the Lydian Hoard was thin in ways that experienced curators would have recognized immediately. The objects had no excavation records, no export permits, no chain of ownership traceable to any legitimate source. They had appeared, as looted objects tend to appear, suddenly and at a price, with an origin that resisted verification. The museum purchased them regardless. What is interesting about institutional behavior of this kind is that it rarely involves a single individual making a clear decision to do something wrong. It involves, instead, a series of individuals making a series of smaller decisions, each one defensible in isolation, until the accumulation of those decisions produces an outcome that none of them would have endorsed if stated plainly at the outset. Someone decided the documentation was thin but not disqualifying. Someone decided the objects were too significant to pass up. Someone decided that asking harder questions might produce answers that would complicate a purchase they had already, in some internal sense, already committed to. For 25 years, the hippocamp brooch sat in a display case in New York. Scholars published papers about it. It appeared in the museum's published literature as an example of Lydian craftsmanship. The granulation under the exhibition lights looked exactly as it had in the burial chamber, each bead precisely placed, the surface unbroken. In 1987, the Turkish government filed suit. 3 days before the statute of limitations would have transferred permanent legal ownership to the museum. The legal proceedings lasted 6 years. They cost Turkey, by various estimates, more than $30 million. In 1993, a federal court concluded that the objects had been stolen and that the institution holding them had known this at the time of purchase. The Metropolitan Museum returned the Lydian Hoard. The brooch was packed in archival tissue and transported to Uşak by diplomatic courier. At the museum, a man named Kazım Akbıyıkoğlu was waiting. Uşak, Turkey, 1993 to 2005. Akbıyıkoğlu had spent years working toward that moment. As director of the Uşak Museum of Archaeology, he had been the public face of the repatriation effort, giving interviews, lobbying government officials, maintaining correspondence with Turkish and American legal teams across 6 years of proceedings. He was not an administrator who had been assigned to a cause. He was, by every available account, genuinely invested in it. There is a kind of person who forms a deep attachment to an object they have never held, who builds, over years of research and advocacy, an intimate relationship with a thing that exists, for them, only in photographs and legal documents. When the crates arrived at Uşak and were opened in the storeroom, and Akbıyıkoğlu finally held the brooch, it is worth considering what that moment felt like. 14.3 grams. The particular warmth that 22-carat gold holds in the palm, the way it absorbs body heat and returns it slowly, the way it sits in the hand, with a quality that is difficult to describe, but that anyone who has held ancient gold at high purity will recognize immediately. He had fought for this. He had won. The brooch was placed in the permanent collection. A label was written. Visitors came. School children pressed their faces against the glass. Years passed. What happened to Akbıyıkoğlu in the years that followed is, in its broad outline, ordinary. Debts accumulated, gambling, over time, at a scale that became impossible to manage. His marriage ended badly. He was living, by 2005, under a pressure that had become structural, not a crisis, but a permanent condition. The kind of financial distress that does not announce itself dramatically, but simply narrows the available options, month by month, until certain things that were previously unthinkable begin to present themselves as merely difficult. He had the keys to the storeroom. He had the institutional authority to handle the collection without supervision. He was the director of the museum that held the brooch, and in 2005, the Uşak Museum did not have the resources, the staffing, or the mandate to subject its own director to meaningful oversight. Between March and August of 2005, Akbıyıkoğlu replaced the brooch with a forgery. The forgery was cast using modern methods. It was made from a gold alloy heavier than 22 carats, denser in a way that ancient gold worked by hand is not. There was no granulation, no colloidal soldering, no beads fused at the atomic level by a craftsman who had spent years learning a technique that the modern world could approximate but not replicate. The forgery weighed 23.5 grams. It was placed in the display case in the same position, under the same label, in the same light that had been falling on the original for 12 years. He had spent years arguing that this object deserved to be here. He had been celebrated for that argument. And one afternoon in 2005, he walked out of the museum with the original brooch in a bag, leaving behind something that looked, from the other side of a glass case, close enough. The display case was not empty. It held something, just not the right thing. In 2006, an anonymous letter reached the office of the governor of Uşak and the Turkish Ministry of Culture. The letter stated, without elaboration or explanation of how the writer knew, that the brooch on display at the Uşak Museum was not the original. A forensic examination was ordered. When the object was removed from the case and weighed, the result required no further analysis. 23.5 grams, not 14.3. The investigation that followed confirmed what the weight had already made clear. The granulation pattern on the forgery had been cast rather than applied. Under examination, the surface showed none of the microscopic characteristics of colloidal soldering. The alloy composition was inconsistent with 6th century BCE Lydian metalwork. The forgery was competent, meaning it had been made by someone with knowledge of what they were copying, but it was not, and could not be, the original. Akbıyıkoğlu was arrested. At trial, he was sentenced to 13 years. In his public statements, he did not offer a straightforward account of his decisions. What he offered instead was the explanation that had been circulating around this object since the first men climbed out of that tunnel in 1965. The curse of Croesus. He was not the first person in this story to reach for that explanation when the alternative, which was a clear-eyed account of his own choices, proved too uncomfortable to articulate. The men who dug up the tomb had mentioned the curse. The smuggler who moved the objects out of Turkey had mentioned it. Each of them had mentioned it in the context of misfortunes they preferred not to attribute to their own conduct. Akbıyıkoğlu mentioned it in a courtroom, 13 years after he had held the real brooch in his hands for the first time and felt, in 14.3 grams of ancient gold, the weight of everything he had worked for. What Turkey lost in 2006 was not only the brooch. What it lost was the coherence of what had been done to recover it. The $30 million, the 6-year legal campaign, the argument made in an American federal court that objects belonged to the culture that produced them, all of that had depended on the assumption that once returned, the brooch would be cared for properly. That the institutions of a country willing to fight that publicly for a stolen object could be trusted with the thing they had fought for. The Metropolitan Museum had purchased objects it knew to be stolen. That had been established in court, in plain language. For years, that institution had been the villain in this story, and not without reason. But after 2006, the story had acquired a second act that complicated the first one considerably, and that complication had no satisfying resolution. The forgery in the display case did not merely represent a theft, it represented the collapse of the argument that the first theft had been wrong. Sardi, 560 BCE. The craftsman who made the brooch did not know it would be buried. He made it to be worn. The hippocamp on its surface was a creature of transitions, of thresholds, of the border between the visible world and whatever lay beyond the edge of the known sea. He worked the granulation by hand, bead by bead, in a workshop that no longer exists, in a city whose name has changed twice since his death, in a kingdom that no subsequent civilization considered worth preserving in detail. He did not put a curse on it. That interpretation came later, from other mouths, in service of other purposes. The objects he made were not magical. They were technically extraordinary, which is a different thing, and in some respects, a more durable one. Magic fades when belief fades. Craftsmanship is indifferent to belief. The granulation on the hippocamp brooch did not require anyone to believe in it in order to remain intact for 25 centuries underground. It remained intact because the man who made it understood, at a level that has not been surpassed, what gold could do under heat and pressure and time. Germany, 2012. Interpol and Turkish authorities located the brooch in Germany in 2012. It had moved through a network of private collectors and intermediary dealers who handled objects whose provenance could not withstand scrutiny, objects that existed in a grey market between the criminal and the merely unethical. It was recovered and returned to Turkish custody. Where it is now is not public information. It is not on display. It is not in a case with a label beneath it and school children pressing their faces against the glass. Whether it sits in a secure government archive, or in the holding area of an ongoing legal process, or in a location whose details are withheld for reasons that have not been explained, has not been confirmed by any official source. The brooch has now spent more of its existence out of sight than in it, 25 centuries in a sealed burial chamber. A quarter century in the storerooms and display cases of an institution on the other side of the world. 13 years in a museum that was, without the knowledge of anyone visiting it, displaying the wrong object entirely. And now this, an undisclosed location, an unconfirmed status, a gap in the public record where the object should be. In 1965, it had taken 3 men with shovels to bring it back into the light. This time, no one is digging. Lot 47, gold brooch, Lydian, circa 560 BCE, hippocamp form, granulation detail, colloidal soldering technique, height 3.4 centimeters, width 2 centimeters, weight 14.3 grams, recovered at Gure, Western Turkey, 1965, removed without permit, held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, 1968 to 1993. Repatriated following federal court ruling, removed from the Uşak Museum of Archaeology by its director between March and August 2005, and replaced with a forgery, located in Germany, 2012. Current status, unconfirmed. Estimate, not available. Provenance, as above. Kazım Akbıyıkoğlu served his sentence. He never publicly identified the buyer. The Metropolitan Museum of Art acknowledged in court that it had purchased objects it knew to be stolen. The institution remains open. Its collection remains largely intact. No individual at the museum was charged with a criminal offense. The men who dug up the tomb in 1965 were eventually arrested, after one of them informed on the others when he felt the proceeds had been divided unfairly. One lost 3 sons under separate circumstances. One spent his later years telling people about 40 barrels of gold buried in a location he could never quite specify. The smuggler who moved the objects out of Turkey lived out his remaining years in what the records describe, in notably vague terms, as persistent misfortune. Each of them, at some point in their subsequent lives, mentioned the curse. Not one of them mentioned what they had done. This is, perhaps, the most consistent feature of the brooch's history, not the misfortunes that followed it, which can be accounted for by ordinary cause and effect, but the refusal, in every case, of the people who handled it to accept a straightforward account of their own choices. The thieves blamed a curse. The museum blamed documentation gaps. The director blamed a curse again. The pattern is not mystical. It is very human, and it is not specific to this object. It is simply more visible here, because the object itself is documented well enough that the gap between what happened and how the participants chose to describe it is unusually clear. The brooch is somewhere tonight. 14.3 grams of 22-carat Lydian gold, made 6 centuries before the Common Era, by a craftsman whose name no record preserved. The granulation intact. The hippocamp still mid-leap between one world and whatever comes after. Someone knows where it is. The curse of Croesus, if it exists, does not require an ancient king to sustain it. It requires only a man who decides that the rules that apply to everyone else do not, for reasons he finds privately convincing, apply to him. There have been several of those in this story. There will likely be more.